Hello and welcome to Radio Tarana's digital space. Today I'm in conversation with a man who needs no introduction whatsoever. He is one of the finest orators in 21st century, the best-selling author, 2 times Member of Parliament, and these days, if you happen to check whether you speak correct English, you do not really check it in Oxford, but you rather check it with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. What a delight it is, Mr. Tharoor.
Nice to meet you, Jilesh.
How are you doing?
Not too bad.
Now,
Not too bad.
Mr. Tharoor, to start with, I would like to talk about the book Inglorious Empire. If you could please talk me through the genesis of the writing process, on how it happened, and why did you feel the need to really do a book on that?
Well, I didn't actually myself. What happened was that I happened to participate in a debate at the Oxford Union, which was their topic, that the British owed reparations to their former colonies. And though I was never a big enthusiast for reparations, I took the opportunity to deliver a short and I think fairly punchy speech on the evils of British colonialism in a country like India, and that just went viral on YouTube.
Some 3 million.
3 million in the first 24 hours.
Yeah,
it was just quite insane. So at that point, because everybody was talking about this in India, my publishers called and said, "Got to make a book out of this." And I said, "Don't be silly. Everyone knows this already. Why should we bother?" And he said, "No, everyone doesn't know this already, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral." So that seemed to make some sense, and that's why I started writing a book, which I hadn't believed would be necessary to write. But once I did, I took the structure of an argument rather than a narrative. So it's not a story, it's an argument about British colonialism. And knowing the main points I wanted to make, I then researched supporting material on these points, in many cases finding out the things were even worse than I had remembered from my own relatively casual reading. So in a more structured way, I have come up with what is perhaps the most comprehensive indictment of British rule in India.
Right. Now, in the same book, Dr. Tharoor, you compared Mr. Churchill to Hitler.
Yeah.
Now, what I am trying to understand here is, as a writer, because of course there's Hitler there who's like an extremist all around the world, like people consider him to be one of the extremists, and then there's Churchill here. In one part of the world he's been considered godly. When you write a book on a subject and try to draw a comparison between these two, as a writer, how difficult was it to articulate right words and convey the same message that you wanted to?
Well, I think I was probably more intemperate in interviews than in the book. In the book, I've just given chapter and verse. I've given the facts. I've given quotations from Churchill's own words.
Yep.
When Hitler speaks ill of the Jews, he's rightly condemned as a racist. When Churchill says, "I hate Indians, they're a beastly people with a beastly religion," when Churchill says, when confronted with the facts of the famine caused by his policies, he says, "It's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits." When Churchill is told that 4.3 million people have died in Bengal because of his decisions, including his decisions not to allow Australian ships laden with wheat to unload their wheat at Calcutta docks, but obliging them to carry on to boost buffer stocks in Europe for a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia, in which Churchill says the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis matters much less than that of sturdy Greeks. When Churchill says all of these things, no one says this is the most vile, appalling, racist human being on the planet. It is quite startling that, all of this is there on record, and then when conscience-stricken British officials sent an official note to Churchill's Prime Minister asking him to reverse his policies that were killing people in the famine, all this man could bring himself to do was to write on the margin, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And you expect us to swallow the British line that this is some sort of freedom and apostle of freedom and democracy. He is clearly, from the point of view of anybody who happened to be non-white, just as bad as Hitler. There is no comparison. Hitler killed 6 million, Churchill killed 4.3 in this one episode, but he's made other decisions that also cost lives. There is very little to choose between them. The only difference is that Churchill's side won the war and Hitler's side lost. lost. But ultimately, Hitler was evil in his attitude to one group of people, the Jews, and along with them the Gypsies, the Sinti people, and other racial minorities. I don't think Hitler would have been very, very pleasant to brown and black people either, but those weren't his priorities. In the case of Churchill, because his empire had subjugated under the hobnail British boot brown and black people, those are the ones for whom his contempt was most manifest. But I see no difference in their racial attitudes whatsoever.
Right. So now this brings me to my next question on how history has been taught in India. Do you feel there's a need of any change in the way history is being taught in India?
Well, the thing is that history has become contested battleground, and in a rather superficial and silly way, because you've now got BJP state governments trying to rewrite history books to make Hindus into heroes and Muslims into villains. That kind of rewriting of history is disastrous. I think it actually has much more to do with political agendas in the present than with any meaningful understanding of history. I think the only way in which we should look at history is as a rich source of information that can be interpreted according to our present lights, but where all sorts of interpretations ought to be possible. There should never be just one approved or received view of anything. And as far as I'm concerned, if the BJP wants to propagate a particular perception or a particular perspective on history, others should be free to offer counter evidence, just as I have no problem that people are offering counter arguments to everything I have to say about the British. That's fine. That's what history should serve, to stimulate argument and discussion. There should not be one rewritten approved view, in my view.
Right. Now, since you bring BJP into the conversation, you have a book by the name of Why I Am Hindu. Now, some skeptics would question the very intent of the title of the book. My question to you is, why this recent embrace of Hinduism?
It's not recent at all as far as I'm concerned, because I've been writing about my feelings and concerns for about 30 years on the subject. If you go back to the Great Indian Novel in 1989, there's this entire theme of dharma and the role of dharma in Hindu life. If you look at my novel Riot, which describes violence in the lead up to the Ram Janmabhoomi agitation, I talk about the rise of Hindutva and the different arguments being made at the time. And in India from Midnight to the Millennium, 20 years ago, in 1997, I published very personal reflections on my feelings as a Hindu 5 years after the destruction of the Babri Masjid. So there's nothing new or sudden embrace or any of these things that ignorant critics have said. These have been prefigured in my earlier writings for a long time. But for the first time, I felt the need to actually make an entire book out of these sets of concerns, rather than confine myself to a few pages in other books. I felt it was important to actually devote an entire analysis, and I'm very pleased that it seems to have worked for a lot of people, because every day in India somebody comes up to me saying, you speak for me too, because this is the Hinduism I grew up believing in, but I wouldn't have found the words to express it as you have done. And that means a lot to me, because I believe the Hinduism I'm describing is the Hinduism that the silent majority of Indian Hindus have grown up with, have grown up living, believing, being taught, hearing, etc. And it's certainly
just on the point of Hinduism, I would like to question. Now, since you describe Hinduism, I want to understand how different is your Hinduism from the Hindutva that BJP...
Hindutva is not Hinduism. Hindutva is a political ideology which reduces the soaring majesty of the Upanishads, the Gita, the various sacred texts and lessons of Hinduism into the sort of petty bigotry of the British football hooligan. The British football hooligan says that my team is better than your team and I'll bash you on the head if you disagree. That is what the Hindutva ideology has reduced Hinduism to. That's not Hinduism. Hinduism is a large, open, eclectic, all-embracing faith. It is a faith that profoundly believes that all ways of reaching God are equally valid. Swami Vivekananda talked about how various religions are, for the Hindu, the same, because just as all rivers can flow into the same sea, so also all ways of stretching out one's hands to the divine are equally valid. And he says something very profound in his famous speech to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. He says, "My religion has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance." And I found this a profoundly important idea, because the entire point about tolerance, which we're all taught as a virtue, we're all encouraged to admire tolerant kings and tolerant governments and so on, but tolerance is really a very patronizing idea. It says essentially, look, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's what tolerance says. Whereas what Vivekananda is talking about is acceptance. Acceptance says, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. Now that is a wonderful basis for understanding Hinduism and Hindu thought, and also a wonderful basis for surviving in a pluralistic, multi-religious democracy like India. Unfortunately, Hindutva has none of this. It has no real Hindu essence to it. It is, in fact, reducing Hinduism to a community identity and projecting that identity at the expense of and in criticism of other identities. That's certainly profoundly un-Hindu, and I would even go so far as to say, having seen them at work for some years now, that it's anti-Hindu, Hindutva.
If you allow me, I'll ask you my one last question. How much of Shashi, the politician, come in the way of Shashi, the writer, when you write a book on something like why I am Hindu? Because I'm sure people in India would really question the very intent of the title, saying what's happening in the current political diaspora in India. Do you have that in mind at all?
The first half of the book is simply a description of what I presumptuously call my Hinduism, but in some detail with quotes from the ancient texts, as well as the lessons taught by the great preceptors and Mahatmas of Hinduism, and the Hinduism that I grew up with and discussed and questioned and talked about. So that's the first 138 pages of the book. Thereafter, there is an analysis of Hindutva largely in its own words. I quote Savarkar, the founder of the Hindutva concept, Golwalkar, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, in their own words, explaining, I hope very fairly and objectively, what they believe and stand for. And then I have a final section saying, reclaiming Hinduism, where, if you like, the political argument also comes in, which is of the great importance of taking back Hinduism from the bigots, from the narrow-minded sectarian elements, for the broad-minded, liberal point of view that Hinduism has traditionally and philosophically always espoused. So, yes, there is in that part of the book an infusion of my political convictions. I'm not at all willing to identify with what the Hindutva Brigade claims is the Hinduism that we should all be paying allegiance to. I pay allegiance to an older, more authentic, better grounded, more philosophically supported Hinduism, which is my faith. And that faith needs to reclaim itself back from the clutches of these men of straw who have tried to reduce it to a political identity game.
So just one quick question before we end this. The recent election in the southern part of India, Karnataka, how do you see that election, and what's your opinion on what just happened?
Well, I just think that it's been very sad to see the governor misusing his authority and his power to give a party that does not command a majority in the assembly a chance to essentially purchase that majority by giving them the right to be sworn in as a government and giving them 15 days to buy up enough members of the winning coalition. That, I think, is really quite shameful. It also flies in the face of the precedent set in Goa, in Meghalaya, in Manipur, and in Bihar, where a coalition of two parties or more, in some of those places it's 3 and 4 and 5 parties, has been allowed to form a government because they commanded a majority in the assembly. In the case of Karnataka, a coalition of two parties, the Congress and the JDS, has a majority. It's a matter of declared numbers and record. Instead of which, we are seeing the disgraceful spectacle of the party that does not command a majority, essentially seeming to try and buy off defections from individual members in order to create that majority, and the governor, who's a constitutional figurehead, playing along with it. No wonder that today, Friday, all across India, there are demonstrations and protests lamenting the murder of democracy in India.
Right. It was a pleasure chatting with you, Mr. Tharoor. Thank you for your time.
Nice talking to you. Thanks very much.